Coming to you now is Bread of His Presence with your host, Pastor Cameron Uri, Senior Pastor and Bible Teacher at Renton Park Chapel in Renton, Washington.
Well, greetings and welcome again to Bread of His Presence. If you've been following us, you'll know that we've been focusing on the first part of the greatest mitzvah or commandment given in the Old Testament, which Jesus in Mark chapter 12 pulls directly from the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. And this has to do with what the first of the two tablets of the Ten Commandments was all about: our vertical relationship with God, being completely united with Him and Him alone. But Tablet 2 has to do with the horizontal, our relationships with one another. And so the second part of the great mitzvah, which has to do with loving our neighbor, Jesus pulls actually from the book of Leviticus to address our horizontal relationships. Now it says in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, "You shall not take vengeance, and you shall not keep your anger against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh." Now, it should not be overlooked that Jesus pulls both of these commandments from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. But there's also another thing that links these two verses, and that is that both share the word ve'ahavta, and you shall love. Now, what is happening here is that Jesus is tying these two love commands together by using a fascinating rabbinic rule called Gezerah Sheva, which means a comparison of equals. I'd always seen the first commandment as greater, and the second as, well, just that, second. But that's not what's really going on here. Because the two verses share a common word that's only found a couple other places in the scriptures, you can assume that one line is actually expanding on the other as an explanation of how we are to love. And so loving God requires, and is indeed expressed best by, loving our neighbors. You see, you can't have the vertical love of God without the horizontal relationship with your neighbor. And you can't love fully horizontally apart from first loving God. And so that's why these two commandments are really one mitzvah. You can't separate them. But how do you love your neighbor as yourself? This is where things get very interesting because Jesus was so revolutionary on this. As we have seen in and throughout the course of this series, Jesus actually had a lot in common with many of the other rabbis of his time. Their teaching methods, the idioms they used, their logic were all very, very similar. However, there was one key difference that we cannot ever afford to overlook. And we see it commented on by the crowds immediately after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Because after hearing him deliver that awe-inspiring sermon on that hillside above the Sea of Galilee, it says, "Now it happened that when Jesus had finished these words, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. For he was teaching them as one having authority, and not as their scribes." And what this meant was that Jesus was speaking with the pretense that he knew the mind of God. And the way he used the Old Testament made it sound like they were his own words. And they were. But the reason that's so important for us to grasp is because he does know the mind of God. Because he is God, he is therefore able to reveal God's thinking behind the laws that he gives. Some of you may have heard of Hillel and Shammai. Both were very famous Jewish scholars who lived just prior to the time of Jesus. Shammai was active in the 1st century BC and was known for his very strict approach to interpreting the laws of the Torah. Hillel lived slightly later and was active between 30 BC and AD 10. He was known for his gentleness and his moderation in the interpretation of the law. His school of disciples often debated the disciples of Shammai over their stricter interpretations of Jewish law. And so looking at these debates really helps shed a lot of light on the context of Jesus' sayings. Because sometimes Jesus would be more on the side of Shammai. Other times he would be more on the side of Hillel. But because none of the other rabbis were God, as one scholar points out, many of the other rabbis tended to focus on defining the minimum requirements of the law. They tried to outline exactly what you should and should not do to stay within the law. And that approach makes sense because by nature, laws are limited to defining the least good thing you can do and still stay within the boundaries. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't work on the Sabbath. But what the rabbis lacked was the authority to say, this is what God really meant when he told us to keep the Sabbath holy. Because who could know that but God himself? And so their strategy was to keep tightening the minimums, hoping that doing so would bring people closer and closer to holiness. But the author I was reading says that while others worked on defining the boundaries, Jesus took the opposite approach. Because instead of focusing on minimums, he focused on maximums, speaking about the ultimate aims of the law. As the author of the Torah, she writes, Jesus alone was able to explain its true intention. Like other rabbis, Jesus' goal was to teach his followers how to do God's will. But he did it by bringing the Torah to its greatest expression. Donald Hagner writes, Jesus is the final authoritative interpreter of Torah. He penetrates in every instance beyond the letter of the law to the very will of God. And he also points out that in several places in rabbinic literature, the rabbis predict that the Messiah will bring a new and greater understanding of the Torah. And of course, Jesus does. Now, one author points out one instance that is a case in point. She says, compare the way that Hillel summarized the Torah to the way Jesus summarized it 40 years later. One day, an impatient Gentile asked Hillel to explain the entire Torah while standing on one foot. And Hillel's response was brilliant. He said, whatever is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. You see, Hillel clearly summarized the law. Indeed, you could even repeat this formulation while you're standing on one foot. Those who followed this teaching could achieve a minimum standard of conduct, keeping themselves safely within the boundaries of the Torah. But listen to Jesus' answer. He says, love your neighbor as yourself. By flipping Hillel's formulation, Jesus compels us to focus not on the minimum, but the maximum, pointing out the ultimate goal of following God's will. You see, the difference between Hillel's approach and Jesus's, I think it may sound subtle, but actually it's revolutionary. Because most of us can find it in our power to avoid being hateful, but how hard it is to love our neighbors as ourselves. And the author I was reading says, let's look at how this might play out in our own lives. When there's a snowstorm, Hillel says, shovel your sidewalk so no one will slip and hurt themselves. Jesus says, shovel your sidewalk and then shovel your neighbor's sidewalk too. When your little sister borrows your clothes, Hillel says, don't ransack her closet. But Jesus says, open your closet door and see what else she might like to wear. When you're pinched financially, Hillel says, don't steal. But Jesus says, look around to see who's worse off than you and find a way to help them. When someone annoys you, Hillel says, don't badmouth that person. But Jesus says, find something kind to say to such a person. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, Hillel says, go with him. But Jesus says, go with him 2 miles. In other words, what Jesus is saying here, but also in many places in his teachings, especially the Sermon on the Mount, is don't live by the minimum. Don't just do the least you can to get by. No, love God with all of who you are, with your maximum. Seek to do everything you can to please God. And that begins, first and foremost, with how you and I love our neighbors. Because to love them fully is the fruit of loving God fully. Loving them to the maximum is loving Him to the maximum. Now, there's something else that we need to note from this Leviticus passage that Jesus is pulling from, because how does it open? We see later a bunch of great things that surround this particular text, but for now, note the phrase that comes immediately before, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. What does it say? You shall not take vengeance, and you shall not keep your anger against the sons of your people. Well, what does that mean? Who might you take vengeance against? Your enemy who has wronged you, right? Now, in light of that, who is the neighbor being referenced? Your enemy. Does that shock you? I think we often assume that this is some kind of new teaching of Jesus to love our enemies, but it's not. Loving your enemies is Old Testament doctrine. Now, you might ask, well, what about Matthew 5:43, in which Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbors and hate your enemy. Christians often assume that that is either what the Old Testament actually teaches, or maybe the Pharisees taught, or both. But nowhere does it occur in the Old Testament or in any of the rabbinic writings. However, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered back in the 1940s, the answer finally came to light. The authors of these documents, you remember the Essenes, they gave this phrase, love your neighbor, this spin. Every day, they pledged themselves to love all the sons of light, each according to his lot in God's design, and to hate all the sons of darkness, each according to his guilt in God's vengeance. That's a quote. You see, they were ticking down the days until the Messiah would arrive to start the war against evil and slay all the wicked on earth. Obviously, they didn't understand the spirit of the law that was revealed in Leviticus 19:18. But you see, that is what Jesus is helping people to return to. God, even in the Old Testament, wants us to take it to the next level. He doesn't leave it at just not doing the bad thing. He then says, but you shall love your neighbor, even your enemy, as yourself. And so this week and every week, let's live that maximum focused way of life, where we actively show love to those around us, even our enemies, as Christ also did for us. Let's do so. Amen.
Today's episode of Bread of His Presence is brought to you by Renton Park Chapel, a church that is committed to the ministry of sharing the joy of hearing and doing God's Word, and to the mission of bringing people into the life-giving presence of Jesus Christ, in and through vibrant preaching, teaching, Bible study, prayer, and ministry to a world that is in desperate need of the healing touch of Jesus Christ. If you'd like to learn more about our ministry here at Renton Park Chapel, or would like to subscribe to the Bread of His Presence podcast, you can visit us online at rentonparkchapel.org or breadofhispresence.org. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for listening. And may you know all the fullness of having in your life the bread of the presence of God.